The points that we just heard there. Jeremy, let me get to you if I can. The jurors, as we heard from Yasmin here, they want to hear, and we'll just give you the wide swath here, but they want to hear parts of David Pecker's testimony, as we said, about the phone call he testified that he had with Mr. Trump during an investor meeting. That was in June of 2016, during which Mr. Trump acknowledged he knew Karen McDougal. They want to hear Pecker's testimony regarding the Trump Tower meeting. They also want to hear Michael Cohen's testimony regarding that same meeting. What are your key takeaways, and why are those requests notable?
You know, if I'm Team Trump, or more specifically Donald Trump, I'm a little anxious and nervous with this request. Why is that? Well, I think that they're looking to David Pecker, to Yasmin's point, about someone who can corroborate not Michael Cohen, but the whole story. And that does include Michael Cohen, but can tell the story and tell the narrative that, yes, Donald Trump was central to this purported conspiracy to promote an election. And we know that not because of Michael Cohen. We know that because we have David Pecker and potentially indirectly the former president's own words. So I'm concerned, if I am Team Trump, and keep in mind this, though, that not every one of those jurors may have said, I wanted to hear it. It could have been 3 of them. It could have been all of them. They could be trying to convince one person, hey, you have it wrong. But when I also hear that they want to hear Michael Cohen's description of those events at Trump Tower, you know, are they looking to try to corroborate and see if it's consistent or not, and how it's different? That could be a very good question. But overall, I'm more concerned if I'm the defense than I am the prosecution.
Yeah, Jeremy, you make an important point, right? Because if you want to hear David Pecker on this, and you want to hear Michael Cohen on this, if those two are in line, then it could give the jurors a pretty good impression that Michael Cohen had corroborated statements, right? That despite him being described by the defense as the greatest liar of all time, the gloat, as they said, this could be significant here. At least let me bring you in specifically on the second note right now. That's about the jury instructions. What's striking here is that the jurors do not have a copy of the judge's instructions, 55 pages of them. The media has been provided a copy of these. Is that typical, and are these more complicated, these juror instructions? This was a lot to try to make sense of for those of us who got to reread it multiple times.
Yeah, sure. This was a lot even for me, and I'm an attorney. So this is a really old school way of doing things, not sending the written instructions back to the jury. In a lot of jurisdictions, including the District of Columbia, jurors do have copies of the instructions. I think the rationale for doing it the New York style is that way the jury is listening to the judge and how the judge has instructed them. And if they have questions, they will come, like we saw today, provide a note, and the jury and the judge will then explain it to them. However, what we've just seen is the argument for why they should have the instructions. It's not one question. They want all of the instructions again. And that's because this is a complicated
case. An hour and 15 minutes worth of reading instructions, right? If you've played a board game with your kids before, you know by the time you're flipping the page, this has already gotten perhaps too complicated than you guys are ready for. This is 55 pages worth, but you're saying that that's not unusual in a case of this kind.
No, I'm not saying it's not unusual. It is rather unusual. I'm saying this used to be the way things were done, not so now. I think it's unusual that Manhattan is still employing this, and perhaps after this trial, there'll be a good argument to start sending instructions back. The case is just simply too complicated not to let the jury read for their own. It's gonna take a long time, as we're seeing. This is taking an hour and 15 minutes out of the deliberations to go over the instructions again.
No doubt. So, Jeremy, let me ask you, if I can, about this for a second. One of the key takeaways from the judge earlier reading these instructions was that they do not need to be unanimous in their conclusion about what other alleged crime Mr. Trump may have intended to cover up. He said, although you must conclude unanimously that the defendant conspired to promote or prevent the election by unlawful means, you don't have to be unanimous in what the unlawful mean is. In determining if Mr. Trump used unlawful means to influence 2016 election, the jury may consider violations of the Federal Election Campaign Act, falsification of other business records, or violation of tax laws. Can you help make some better sense of this? Because the point was, in simplest of terms, as I understand it, they don't have to be in agreement about what law he was trying to cover up as long as they think he was doing it in an effort to cover a broken law up, correct?
Correct. So the way I can try to make it a little bit easier is change that out of this topic. Burglary is a term we all have heard of before. And burglary is basically a trespass in New York State with the intent to commit another crime. So if you're trespassing, we'll call that piece one. And the intent to commit another crime could be to sell drugs in the building. It could be to commit a sex crime. It could be to steal and commit a larceny. That next piece, you would not have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the reason why you committed that burglary is because you had the intent to steal as opposed to commit a sex crime or damaged property. Taking that here, that same philosophy is you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there was an intent to commit this other crime or conceal it. But what that other crime is, you do not have to prove that piece beyond a reasonable doubt. And you, the jury, can differ as to what it may be as long as that initial intent existed. This is more complicated because of the nature, but it can be used in other crimes in New York that are fairly, I wouldn't say routine or mundane, but not as sort of invoking as this.
Yeah, and this is interesting, right? Because there wasn't anybody who testified about whether there were violations of the Federal Election Campaign Act. It was all about the cover-up, so to speak, in the course of this process. Which is interesting in itself. Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Let me go back to the courthouse if I can. Yasmin, to you again, we have reported now, we have been told that the jurors have been dismissed for the day. They'll begin the day tomorrow with the reading of the instructions. Donald Trump and his team had been, well, I guess just cooling their heels in a neighboring courtroom, waiting to know whether they'd be invited back in. What else has been going on in and around that courthouse as we've waited over the course of these several days, several hours for some better answers?
So you mentioned the jury has been dismissed. They're going to come back tomorrow at 9:30 in the morning to resume. Donald Trump, as you mentioned, also still inside the building because both the prosecution and the defense have to agree on which pages are actually going to be read back to the jury per what it is that they asked for until they basically find those pages first and foremost. Remember, we're looking at six weeks of a trial here, right? A lot of transcripts when it comes to some of these witnesses, especially David Pecker's testimony. By the way, the first witness called to the stand in this trial. Once they agree, once they decide what pages will actually be read back to this jury, that is when they're going to come back in the courtroom, make sure they all agree on it, and then, in fact, they'll be dismissed until tomorrow morning. So 9:30, court is back in session tomorrow morning. They will not go beyond 6 p.m. tomorrow. Remember, court usually ends around 4:30 in the afternoon. The judge says we may ask you to work late. We will not, though, go beyond 6 p.m. Let's not forget, last night they went till about 8:30 or so p.m. to finish up closing arguments there. And the day will start with those jury instructions, an hour and 15 minutes of jury instructions, likely 30 to 45 minutes of reading back this transcript. So far, 4.5 hours of deliberation today. If we put that math together, and I do hate doing math on television, we're looking at not resuming deliberations tomorrow until after all is read, starting at 9:30 in the morning until about 11 or 12 in the afternoon, Peter.
Elise, first of all, Yasmin, thank you to you. Elise, I want to follow up on some of the points that Yasmin was making for us there right now. So let's go 35,000 feet for a second here. What are the key moments, the key decisions that these jurors have to make? What are the crucial moments in the testimony we've seen over the course of the last several weeks that you think are going to be critical to the decisions being made here?
Well, I mean, it's really going to go to what the former president's intent was, right? The question is, and I think they're grappling with it right now with these early meetings with Pecker, was the former president even aware this was going on? Was he part of this scheme for the catch and kill of these stories? And why is that important? It's important because we're talking about that other offense. He entered into this agreement with Cohen and Pecker to catch and kill these stories to benefit his election. He did not want them out, and he did not want them harming his campaign. That is his motive. That is the intent. And that is what the jury really needs to decide. And they don't want to decide it just on Cohen's testimony, and they can't. They were instructed that as an accomplice, you cannot find beyond a reasonable doubt by Michael Cohen's words alone. It needs to be corroborated. And I think that's another reason that they're asking for readback for Pecker's testimony, because he is going to be corroborative of everything that Michael Cohen, especially with respect to this meeting, which is so key. I also want to point out something that is significant. The jury seems to be going in the same chronological order that the prosecution did their closing. We are only in August of 2015 here. That is the Pecker meeting. So it looks like the jury is kind of following this tour guide invitation by the prosecutor, and they're starting with this meeting. But this after the Weisselberg meeting, I would say, is the most significant.
Jeremy, last thought to you quickly here, which is the effort by the prosecutors in their closing arguments was basically to say, hey, we didn't pick this guy as our key witness, as our star witness in Michael Cohen. It is the defendant who picked him, and that's what we have to deal with. If this is a guy that you view as a liar, he's a liar because Donald Trump hired a liar. Is that enough? And is Michael Cohen's fate just intertwined with Donald Trump's? Is their belief of Michael Cohen critical to the decisions they make here?
Well, the prosecution tried to make the point that you didn't have to be only on Michael Cohen. But I think most importantly, to your point you said moments ago, Michael Cohen was not chosen by the prosecution, just like Henry Hill and Sammy the Bull were not chosen by their respective mob flip to testify against the bigger bad guys. You surround yourself with certain people, and you don't surround yourself with people who are in the Boy Scouts when you're committing purported crimes. I think they did a terrific job of corroborating him, and Elise has just pointed out the evidence that they're asking for now is not Michael Cohen directly, it's indirectly Michael Cohen, and it corroborates him. They're doing a good job, and I think these questions show that.
Well, as is always the case, we sit and we wait, and it turns out we'll be waiting at least through a first night until tomorrow to try to get some more answers and perhaps even a verdict. Yasmin Vasugian, Jeremy Saland, Elise Adamson, appreciate all of you. Thanks for getting with us to start your day on this critical day for